My ex-boyfriend Jake married my former best friend Sophie last weekend. What they don't know is that I inherited $100 million 3 months ago. I could have stopped their wedding, paid off their debts, changed everything. Instead, I stayed quiet. Why? Because I wanted to see their true colors first. Stay until the end to find out what happened when I finally revealed the truth. You won't believe their reaction. Hi, I'm Teresa, and this is probably the most complicated story I've ever had to tell. 3 months ago, my life changed in ways I never could have imagined, but nobody around me knew it. Not my friends, not my family, and definitely not my lying, cheating ex-boyfriend and former best friend who just got married. Let me start from the beginning. I work at a small local museum here in town. It's not glamorous work. I give tours to school kids, help with exhibits, and organize dusty artifacts that most people walk past without a second glance. The pay is terrible, but I love what I do. There's something beautiful about preserving history, about helping people connect with stories from the past. I live in a tiny studio apartment, drive a car that's older than some of my coworkers, and honestly, I was okay with that life. I was especially okay with it because I had Jake. We'd been together for 3 years, and I genuinely thought he was the one. He worked in marketing for a mid-sized company, had big dreams about starting his own agency someday, and we'd spend hours talking about our future together. The house we'd buy, the trips we'd take, maybe even kids someday. Jake wasn't rich, but neither was I, and we were building something real together. Or so I thought. And then there was Sophie. Sophie had been my best friend since we were 12 years old. We'd been through everything together: awkward teenage years, college stress, first jobs, heartbreaks, celebrations. She was like a sister to me. When I started dating Jake, Sophie was the first person I called to tell her about this amazing guy I'd met. She was genuinely happy for me, or at least I thought she was. Sophie worked as a receptionist at a dental office, and like me, she wasn't exactly rolling in money. We'd have cheap wine nights at my apartment, complaining about our bosses and dreaming about better lives. She was my roommate for 2 years until Jake and I got serious, and she moved out to give us space. Everything seemed perfect in my little world. 6 months ago, that world completely fell apart. I came home early from work one day because I was feeling sick, and I found them together in my bed. My boyfriend and my best friend, the two people I trusted most in the world, tangled up in my own sheets. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that I actually just stood there for a moment wondering if I was hallucinating. Jake jumped up, stammering excuses about how it just happened and how sorry he was. Sophie wrapped herself in my blanket, and started crying, saying she never meant for me to find out this way, as if there was a good way for me to discover that the two most important people in my life had been lying to me. I threw them both out that day. Jake moved in with Sophie almost immediately, which told me everything I needed to know about how long this had really been going on. I spent the next 2 weeks crying, eating ice cream, and calling in sick to work. My coworkers were worried, my mom kept checking on me, and I felt like my entire life had been a lie. Then, exactly 3 weeks after I caught them together, something impossible happened. My grandmother's lawyer called me. Grandma Rose had passed away 2 months earlier, and I'd attended her funeral, of course. She was 93 and had lived a quiet life in a small house across town. I knew she had some money saved up. She'd always been frugal, but I figured maybe she'd left me a few $1,000s or some jewelry. I was wrong. I was so incredibly wrong. The lawyer, Mr. Patterson, asked me to come to his office to discuss the inheritance. I thought it was just paperwork, maybe signing something to transfer ownership of her old house. Instead, he sat me down and explained that my grandmother had been secretly wealthy my entire life. She'd inherited money from her own family decades ago, invested it carefully, and lived modestly while her fortune grew. She owned properties I'd never heard of, had investments that had been quietly making money for 50 years, and had been living like she was barely getting by when she was actually worth over $100 million. $100 million. I made him repeat it 3 times because I was sure I'd misheard. My sweet, quiet grandmother who clipped coupons and reused tea bags had been richer than some celebrities, and she'd left every penny to me. Mr. Patterson explained that there were some legal requirements to finalize everything, but within a few weeks I would have access to more money than I could spend in several lifetimes. He also mentioned that my grandmother had specifically requested that I keep the inheritance private until I was sure I was ready to handle the changes it would bring to my life. I walked out of that office in complete shock. My grandmother, who I'd loved dearly but never really understood, had essentially made me one of the wealthiest people in the state. I could quit my job, buy a mansion, travel the world, do literally anything I wanted. But as I sat in my car in the parking lot, still processing everything, I had a different thought entirely. I thought about Jake and Sophie. 3 days after the lawyer meeting, Sophie called me. This was the first time either of them had tried to contact me since I'd kicked them out of my apartment. She was crying on the phone, saying how sorry she was, how much she missed our friendship, and how she and Jake really wanted to make things right with me. She asked if we could meet for coffee to talk. I almost said no. Part of me wanted to tell her exactly what I thought of her and hang up. But then I remembered what Mr. Patterson had said about my grandmother wanting me to keep the inheritance private until I was ready. And suddenly I realized I had an opportunity that most people never get. I had the chance to see how people would treat me when they thought I was still just broke, heartbroken Teresa who worked at a museum. So I said yes to coffee. Meeting Sophie again was surreal. She looked nervous, guilty, but also hopeful. She spent 20 minutes apologizing, saying how much she valued our friendship, how she knew what she'd done was terrible, but she hoped we could work through it. She talked about how Jake was a good guy who'd made a mistake, and how they both realized now how much they'd hurt me. I listened to everything she said, and I made a decision that would change the next 3 months of my life. I decided to forgive her. Not because I actually forgave her, but because I wanted to see what would happen next. I wanted to understand who Sophie and Jake really were when they thought they had nothing to gain from me. Sophie was thrilled when I said I wanted to try rebuilding our friendship. She hugged me and cried and promised things would be different. A week later, she asked if I wanted to have dinner with her and Jake together. She said they were both committed to making this work, to proving they could be trustworthy friends. Dinner with them was one of the most bizarre experiences of my life. Jake was overly apologetic, almost performative in how sorry he seemed. Sophie kept touching his arm and talking about their relationship, like it was this beautiful love story that had unfortunately hurt me in the process. They both kept emphasizing how much they valued my friendship and how they wanted me to be part of their lives going forward. That's when Sophie mentioned that they were thinking about getting married. She said it casually, like she was mentioning the weather, but she was watching my reaction carefully. Jake jumped in to say they weren't in any rush, that they wanted to make sure I was comfortable with everything first. They both seemed to be waiting for my blessing, and I realized this was another test I could run. So I told them I thought they should absolutely get married if they were happy together. I said I was working on moving past everything that had happened, and I wanted them to live their lives. Sophie actually cried again and said I was the most generous person she'd ever known. Over the next few weeks, Sophie started calling me regularly. She'd update me on wedding planning, ask my opinion on dresses and venues, and slowly started mentioning how expensive everything was. A wedding dress cost so much more than she'd expected. The venue they wanted required a huge deposit. Jake's salary was good but not great, and they were already living paycheck to paycheck. I listened to all of this with fascination. Here was my former best friend, who had betrayed me in the worst possible way, now treating me like her closest confidant again. And she was starting to hint around about money. The hints became more direct over time. Sophie would mention how stressed Jake was about wedding costs, how they might have to postpone everything or have a much smaller celebration than they'd dreamed of. She'd sigh and say she wished she had family who could help, but her parents were retired and living on a fixed income. Then came the direct request. Sophie called me crying one evening, saying they were going to lose their venue deposit because they couldn't come up with the money in time. She asked if I could possibly lend them $2,000, just temporarily, until Jake got his next bonus at work. She promised they'd pay me back within 3 months. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Sophie, who had slept with my boyfriend in my own bed, was now asking me for money to help pay for their wedding. The audacity was breathtaking, but it was also the perfect test. I told her I didn't have much saved up, but I could probably manage to lend them $500 from my emergency fund. Sophie was so grateful she started crying again. She said I was saving their relationship, that she'd never forget this kindness, and that she knew I was the most wonderful friend anyone could ask for. Jake called me an hour later to thank me personally and promised they'd pay me back as soon as possible. I transferred the money that night, knowing I'd never see it again, and not caring at all. What I was buying with that $500 was far more valuable than the money itself. I was buying information about who these people really were. The pattern continued over the next 2 months. There was always another wedding expense they couldn't quite cover. The photographer required more money up front than expected. Sophie's dress needed alterations that cost more than budgeted. Jake's car broke down, and they couldn't afford the repairs while also paying for wedding stuff. Each time Sophie would call me sounding stressed and apologetic. She'd explain the situation, mention how bad she felt asking, and then wonder if I might be able to help again. The amounts got bigger. First it was another $300, then $500, then $800. I always said I'd try to help, but could only manage a smaller amount than what they were asking for. Every single time they were incredibly grateful. Sophie would go on about how I was the most generous person she knew, how she was so lucky to have me back in her life, how she couldn't believe I was willing to help them after everything that had happened. Jake would call or text to thank me personally and assure me they were keeping track of everything they owed me. But here's what I noticed. Neither of them ever asked how I was doing. They never wondered if lending them money was putting me in a difficult position financially. They never suggested that maybe they should scale back their wedding plans instead of asking their friend, who they had recently betrayed, to help pay for their celebration. Sophie would spend 30 minutes on the phone talking about wedding stress, but she never once asked about my job, my dating life, or how I was handling everything emotionally. Jake would thank me for the money, but never suggested we hang out just to catch up as friends. I was useful to them again, but only because I was giving them things they needed. 2 weeks before the wedding, Sophie asked me to be her maid of honor. I actually laughed out loud when she asked. I couldn't help it. Sophie seemed confused by my reaction, so I quickly covered and said I was just surprised and honored she would ask. She explained that she'd been thinking about it for weeks, that despite everything that had happened, I was still one of the most important people in her life. She also mentioned that being maid of honor traditionally meant helping with some of the final wedding expenses, and she hoped I'd be okay with that. The flower budget had gone over, and there were still some last-minute costs for the reception. If I could maybe help with another $1,000, it would mean the world to them. I told her I'd be honored to be her maid of honor, and I'd see what I could do about the money. The week of the wedding was when things got really desperate. Jake lost his job. His company was downsizing, and even though he'd been there for 3 years, he was laid off with just 2 weeks' severance pay. Sophie called me in a panic, saying they were thinking about canceling the whole wedding because they couldn't afford it anymore. She was sobbing on the phone, saying it felt like a sign that they weren't meant to be together, that maybe the universe was punishing them for how they'd treated me. She said Jake was devastated, that he felt like he was failing her before they were even married. I listened to all of this and realized that Sophie was presenting me with an opportunity to save their entire relationship. With my secret fortune, I could have easily given them $50,000 and solved all their problems. I could have been the hero of their love story, the friend who stepped up when everything seemed lost. Instead, I told her I could probably scrape together another $300, but that was absolutely all I had left in my savings account. Sophie thanked me through her tears, but I could hear the disappointment in her voice. $300 wasn't going to save their wedding. She started talking about having to call all their guests and cancel everything, about how humiliated they'd be, about how Jake might never forgive himself for not being able to provide the wedding she deserved. That's when other people started stepping in. Jake's parents took out a second mortgage on their house to give them $10,000. Sophie's aunt liquidated her retirement savings to contribute $5,000. Friends and extended family members pitched in hundreds and thousands of dollars to help save their wedding. I watched all of this happen while sitting on $100 million, and I felt absolutely no guilt about it. These people were giving up their financial security to fund a wedding for two people who had shown me exactly how selfish and manipulative they could be. The wedding day finally arrived, and it was a small, modest affair in Jake's parents' backyard. About 50 people attended, mostly family and close friends who had all contributed money to make it happen. The decorations were simple, the food was homemade, and Sophie wore a dress she'd found on sale for $200. As I stood next to Sophie in my burgundy maid of honor dress, watching her marry the man who used to be my boyfriend, I felt strangely peaceful. This wasn't the fairy tale wedding Sophie had dreamed of, but it was exactly what they deserved based on how they'd treated the people who cared about them. During the reception, Sophie and Jake went around thanking everyone for their financial contributions. They had a little speech prepared about how grateful they were for everyone's generosity, how they'd never forget the sacrifices people had made for their special day. When they got to me, Sophie teared up again, talking about how I'd been such an incredible friend, despite everything that had happened between us. She said my willingness to help them financially, even after they'd hurt me so badly, showed what kind of person I truly was. Jake nodded along, saying they'd never be able to repay my kindness. The whole time they were giving this speech, I was thinking about how neither of them had ever asked if I was okay. Neither of them had ever suggested that maybe they should postpone the wedding until they could afford it themselves. Neither of them had ever considered that asking me for money to pay for their celebration might be inappropriate given our history. They saw me as generous, but what they really meant was that I was useful. After the ceremony, while everyone was eating cake and dancing to music from someone's phone playlist, Sophie's cousin Amy came up to me. Amy and I had met a few times over the years, and she'd always seemed like a genuinely nice person. "I think what you've done for Sophie and Jake is incredible," Amy said. "I know how much they hurt you, and the fact that you've been so supportive through all of this, it's really something special." I thanked her for saying that, and then Amy said something that surprised me. "I just hope they appreciate what a rare person you are. Not many people would be willing to give up their savings to help someone who betrayed them like that." Amy had noticed something that Sophie and Jake hadn't. She understood that my help had come at a personal cost, that I might have struggled to find the money I'd been lending them. She saw me as a person making sacrifices, not just as a convenient source of funds. That conversation got me thinking about the difference between how Amy treated me and how Sophie and Jake treated me. Amy expressed genuine concern for my well-being. Sophie and Jake expressed gratitude for my usefulness. As the evening went on, I made a decision. It was time to see what would happen if I told them the truth. I waited until most of the guests had left, and Sophie and Jake were sitting together at the head table, counting the cash gifts they'd received throughout the day. They looked tired but happy, finally relaxed now that their wedding was over, and they'd managed to pull it off. I walked over to them and sat down. "Can I tell you guys something?" I asked. They both turned to me with curious expressions. Sophie reached over and squeezed my hand. "Of course, Teresa, you can tell us anything." I took a deep breath. "I inherited some money recently. Quite a bit of money, actually." Jake raised his eyebrows. "Oh, wow, that's great. Was it from your grandmother who passed away?" "Yes," I said. "It was much more than I expected. Much more than anyone expected." Sophie leaned forward, looking interested. "How much are we talking about? Like enough to pay off your student loans or something?" I smiled. "More like enough to buy this entire neighborhood. Multiple times over." They both stared at me, clearly not understanding what I was saying. "I inherited just over $100 million 3 months ago." The silence that followed was deafening. Sophie's mouth actually fell open. Jake blinked several times like he was trying to process what I'd just said. "$100 million?" Sophie whispered. "Yes," I confirmed. I've been sitting on it for 3 months, watching everything that happened with your wedding, with the money problems, with all the stress and family members sacrificing their savings. Jake was the first to recover. Wait, you've had $100 million this whole time, while we were struggling to pay for the wedding? That's right. Sophie's expression was changing from shock to something else entirely, something that looked almost angry. You let Jake's parents mortgage their house when you could have just written us a check? I could have, I agreed, but I wanted to see something first. See what? Jake demanded. I wanted to see how you'd treat me when you thought I had nothing to offer you. I wanted to understand who you really are when you think I'm just broke, heartbroken Teresa who works at a museum. Sophie stood up so quickly her chair almost fell over. Are you kidding me right now? You let us stress and struggle and beg our families for money when you could have helped us the entire time? You never asked if I was okay, I said calmly. In 3 months of calling me for money, neither of you ever once asked how I was doing emotionally, financially, or otherwise. You saw me as an ATM, not as a person. Jake was shaking his head. That's not true. We were grateful for everything you did. You were grateful that I was useful, I corrected. But you never cared if helping you was hurting me. You never suggested scaling back your wedding plans instead of asking your friends and family to go into debt for your celebration. Sophie was starting to cry, but these weren't the same tears I'd seen from her before. These were angry tears. How could you do this to us? How could you sit there and watch us suffer when you could have fixed everything? The same way you could sit in my bed with my boyfriend, I replied. Some things aren't about what you can do. They're about what you choose to do. Jake stood up too, and for a moment I thought he might actually yell at me. This is insane, Teresa. You've been playing some kind of sick game with us. No, I said, standing up myself. I've been learning who you are when you think I can't do anything for you, and what I learned is that you only care about me when I'm giving you things you need. Sophie was full-on crying now. We do care about you. We invited you to be in our wedding. You invited me to pay for your wedding, I corrected. Being maid of honor came with a bill, remember? The three of us stood there in Jake's parents' backyard, surrounded by the remnants of their modest wedding celebration, and I felt a strange sense of closure. For 3 months I'd wondered if I was being too harsh in my judgment of them. Now I knew I wasn't. Because instead of being horrified that they'd ask their betrayed friend for money, they were angry that I hadn't given them more. Instead of being embarrassed about their behavior, they were upset about my deception. Instead of recognizing how they'd treated me, they were focused on how I'd treated them. Amy, who had been helping clean up nearby, had clearly overheard our conversation. She came over to us looking concerned. Is everything okay over here? Sophie immediately turned to her. Teresa just told us she's had $100 million this whole time and didn't help us with the wedding. Amy looked at me, then back at Sophie. She didn't help you? Didn't she give you guys several $1,000s over the past few months? Well, yes, but... And wasn't she your maid of honor today? Yes, but she could have done so much more if she'd just been honest about... Amy held up her hand. Sophie, I think you should probably stop talking. Jake jumped in. You don't understand, Amy. She's been lying to us for months. Amy looked at him with an expression I'd never seen from her before. Jake... Your friend forgave you for sleeping with her boyfriend, helped pay for your wedding despite being betrayed by both of you, and stood up as your maid of honor today, and you're angry because she didn't give you more money? The silence that followed Amy's question was even more telling than anything Sophie or Jake had said. They both looked like they wanted to argue with her, but they couldn't quite figure out how to defend their position. Amy turned to me. Teresa, I think you're incredible, and I think you learned exactly what you needed to learn tonight. She was right. I had learned everything I needed to know. I looked at Sophie and Jake one last time. I hope you'll be very happy together, I said, and I meant it. You're perfect for each other. I left the reception that night knowing I'd never speak to either of them again, not because I was angry, but because I finally understood who they were, and it wasn't compatible with who I wanted to be. 3 months later, I'm living in a beautiful house I bought with cash. I've set up a foundation to help local museums and educational programs. I've started traveling, learning new things, and meeting people who treat me well whether they think I have money or not. Sophie has tried to call me 17 times since the wedding. Jake has sent numerous text messages apologizing and asking if we can talk. I haven't responded to any of them because there's nothing left to say. The $100 million didn't change who I am, but it showed me very clearly who everyone else is. Some people, like Amy, treated me with kindness and respect regardless of what they thought I could do for them. Others, like Sophie and Jake, only valued me for what I could provide. That's the lesson my grandmother left me along with her fortune. Money doesn't corrupt people. It reveals them. It shows you who was only nice to you because they wanted something, and who genuinely cares about you as a person. I kept the secret not to be cruel, but to see clearly. And now that I can see clearly, I know exactly who deserves to be part of my new life. If you think you would have done things differently, let me know in the comments below. And if you want to hear more stories about how money changes people, subscribe and hit that notification bell, because trust me, I have more stories to tell about the surprising things I discovered once I had the power to help people and chose not to.